Assessments are an essential part of treatment, and as RBTs, you will have a role in these assessments. It's very important when considering treatment that we understand what a child is motivated by. We can do this by systematically determining a child's preference from their highest preferred item to their lowest preferred item. Keep in mind that there are many different methods to do this. And depending on the child that you're working with, one method might be more effective than another. There's several different ways that we do this, including pairing items together and seeing which one a child picks, observing the child naturally in more of a free operant condition, pairing multiple stimuli at the same time, and either replacing it or not replacing it, just to name a few. And again, this will have to be dependent on the child that you're working with, because those children will all have very different skill sets. It's important to keep in mind that preferences, they change. They're not permanent. This means that a client that you're working with might have one preference one day, and then the next day will be completely uninterested in what worked or what they preferred the previous day. It's also important to keep in mind that what you would expect to be a preference might not be. The clients that we work with might have preferences that come across as unusual or different than what we might expect. Understanding the variety of preferences a child might have gives us a really unique opportunity to be creative and to show items or activities that a child might prefer that they just haven't shown us yet. I think that understanding preferences is such an important part of treatment, and once you have a handle on this, you'll be able to find good motivators for the child that will be able to get your goals met. Below you'll see a list of a variety of different methods we can use when assessing preferences of a child. We can ask them, we can observe them in an environment that has a variety of preferences, or we could use trial-based preference assessment methods. It's also important to note that you need to understand the child's ability to make choices and what preference assessment would be most appropriate for them. If you do that, then you'll get more accurate and more effective data that you can use later. For some children, it's just as simple as asking them what it is that they would prefer to work for. You could also consider asking significant others, such as parents, siblings, other providers who have worked with them in the past. Asking questions is a great way to get a good picture or an initial start to assessing the preferences of a child. As we talked about earlier, it's important not to assume a preference of a child, but instead to be very open-ended in the way that you assess them. So for example, if you're asking them questions, make sure that those questions are open-ended and won't end in a yes or a no, but instead would answer the question by giving you what it is that they would like to work for. A good example of this is by asking, what would you like to work for? Some clients will need a more structured question than simply an open-ended, what would you like to work for type question. Some children really need a choice of 2 or maybe 3 items that they can choose from, because having all the options available might be overwhelming for them. And it's important, as you get to know the child you're working with, you'll be able to tell if they are able to answer an open-ended question or if you should modify it for them and give them those options. The hope is that at the end of this preference assessment, we could have a list of choices to choose from for this child so that we know what those preferences are when we're working with them. A free operant preference assessment is a very simple way of observing and recording the activities or items that the individual engages with while you're observing them. During this free operant condition, you would want to be sure that their access to these things is unrestricted, which means that if they pick it, they could pick it again later. Or if they don't pick it, you're not requesting that they do or trying to encourage them to, but instead this is a kind of a free-for-all. They get to pick whatever it is they want. In this free operant assessment, you'll observe for a specified period of time and note how long the person is engaging with each activity and take data on that. There's a couple different ways that you can make these observations happen. One of which is a contrived setting where you would select the toys beforehand and have them just readily available for the child. The other way is naturalistic. So whatever would be in that environment, you just take a look and see what it is that they go for. It's now time for us to practice. Take a look at the video and be sure to take data on this free operant preference assessment. Remember that you're trying to note how long she plays with items to determine what is most preferable. If you have a difficult time telling what toy she's playing with, you can just write toy 1, toy 2, etc. Take a look at the data you have and note what the longest duration was that you measured. We'll now watch again, and this time I've inserted a clock so that I can show what durations I measured. Take a moment to compare what you have to what I had, and let's see if we had the same item that was the most preferable. A single stimulus preference assessment is when you present a specific item and you recognize how that person responded to that item. Do they play with it? How long? Do they push it away? Do they throw it? What is it that they do when it's presented? You also present these stimuli randomly. So there's not really a rhyme or reason to how you present it. It's just you show one and then you show the next. One downfall of this method is that there's no real hierarchy determined, because it's not as if you're pitting two stimuli together. You're just showing, okay, does the child reach for this item or not? This is particularly good for students who have difficulty making choices. Here's a very short example of when a stimulus was presented and the child reacted. A paired choice stimulus preference assessment is when you take two items side by side and you see which one the child or the student will pick. Before you even do this assessment, you have to decide which items you're going to show them. That way, that will save you a bunch of time. You need to systematically match in a random order each set of stimuli, so that each of them are paired with each of the other stimuli. This will help you to rank them. One benefit of this method is that you will have a very clear hierarchy. There will be a low, a medium, and a high preference item determined. As you can imagine, this method does take a while. So if you have a student you're working with who would not be able to attend for that period of time, you might consider doing an alternative method. Here's an example of a data sheet you could use for a paired choice preference assessment. Note at the top that you have the predetermined stimuli that you're going to present. Below, you have the different trials. What's great about this data sheet is that it's already randomly paired for you. So you would just have to match the letter with the item that you're using, and it's already done right there for you. The top right is outlined with the hierarchy. The way that you do this is you take how many times the child selected that item over the amount of times that it was presented, and you'll get a percentage. If you do that for all of them, you'll be able to see that some of the items have a higher percentage and others of the items will have a lower percentage. It's possible that some of the items will have a very similar percentage, but regardless, you'll be able to see in general which items are more preferred than others. The next method we'll talk about is multiple stimulus with replacement. In this method, you show 3 or more stimuli at a time in front of the child, and you ask the child to make a selection. The child is only allowed to pick one item, and as they play with that item or engage with that item, you take data on the item that they selected. Once they've had the predetermined amount of time with the item they selected, you'll then ask for a turn with it, if possible, and then represent all the items, including the item that they already selected. When you present all the items again, remember to vary the position of each item. That way, they don't show that they only select the item that's directly in front of them, or directly to the right of them, or directly to the left of them. Some of the children that we work with will have a place bias. This means that they have a tendency to select items that are always on the right, or always directly in the middle. Here's an example of a data sheet you could use for the multiple stimulus with replacement preference assessment. We'll get to practice this in a couple of minutes. Next, we'll watch a short clip about a preference assessment. On your data sheet, go ahead and write the following: sand, drums, spinner, bubbles, and ball. These will be important when you're taking your data.
We got some stuff here for you today. We got a spinner. Woo! We got some drums. Ba-da-da-da-da. We got some bubbles. Look at this. There you go. We got the wooden ball. We got some sand. All right. Pick one.
Take time now to calculate data. You want to determine which item was the most preferable. You'll see how many times that item was presented and how many times that item was selected. You'll turn it into a fraction. So it'll look like the number of times it was selected over the total number of times it was presented, times 100. Do that for each of the items that you saw. These are the data that I calculated. The next type of preference assessment we'll talk about is a multiple stimulus without replacement. In this preference assessment, at least 2 items at a time need to be presented, but it could be more than this. The learner is then asked to pick one, and they're only allowed to select one item. The rest of the items would be removed or out of their reach for the time that they're engaging with the item they chose. Then you would record the data based on the item that they took. From this, a hierarchy can be determined. A very clear definition of this method is that it can be very quick. A disadvantage could be that there may not be a hierarchy. If you repeat this and you get a different selection, that might tell you that the hierarchy you thought you had might not actually be the true hierarchy. Another disadvantage is that in order to do this properly, the child that you're doing this with needs to be able to scan and select from a larger array size. If the child you're working with can only select from an array of 2, this might not be the best preference assessment to use. Here's an example of a datasheet you could use for the multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment.